For almost 40 years, a man in America kept a small photo album that did not belong to him. Inside were the pictures of a little girl from a poor town on the other side of the world. A girl he had no address for, no full record of, no way to find. He did not know if she was still alive. He only knew that he had made a quiet promise to keep those pictures safe until the day he could put them back in her hands. If you have ever lost touch with someone who once made you feel that you mattered, someone whose kindness arrived exactly when you had stopped expecting any from anyone, then this story already belongs to you, because somewhere in your own life there is probably a face you never properly thanked, a person who reached toward you when the rest of the world was looking away, and then was gone before you could tell them what it meant. By the end of this story, you will understand why that little girl, now grown, crossed an ocean and stood on a quiet residential street in Delaware. And you will understand why the first thing she wanted to say to him was not about everything she had become, but about the one burden she needed him to finally set down. To understand the reunion, you have to go back to the town where it began. In the early 1970s, north of Seoul, there was a town called Dongducheon. It sat in the shadow of a large American military post known as Camp Casey, home to United States Army soldiers stationed in South Korea years after the war that had divided the country. Towns like Dongducheon lived in a strange in-between world. They carried the weight of a country still rebuilding from poverty and conflict, and they were shaped, street by street, by the presence of foreign soldiers who came and went. Out of that in-between world came children who belonged fully to neither side of it. They were the sons and daughters of Korean mothers and American servicemen, and in the Korea of that era, they were often treated as living reminders of a painful history. Many were called names. Many were shut out of schools. Many were quietly abandoned by fathers who shipped home and never sent for them. The word people used for these children was rarely kind. One of those children was a girl named Kim In-soon. Her mother was Korean. Her father was an African-American soldier who had served in Korea and then returned to the United States. By her family's account, her mother's own relatives turned their backs on her for refusing to give up her mixed-race child. So the two of them faced the world largely alone, mother and daughter, in a society that had little room for a girl who looked the way she looked. At school, she was singled out. She was mocked for her skin and her hair, for being visibly different from the children around her, even though she spoke Korean as fluently as any of them. By her own account, she grew up feeling that she was somehow lesser than her classmates, marked as unclean simply for existing. And then, while she was still a teenager, the cruelty reached its conclusion. She was pushed out of school altogether, not for anything she had done, but for how she had been born. She had wanted to become a nurse. She was around 15 years old when that door closed. With no school, no classmates, and few friends, she folded inward. People who saw her in those days remembered a girl who sat by herself, off to the side, saying nothing, a child who had learned that silence drew less attention than hope. It was in that town, around that time, that an American soldier first noticed her. His name was Ronald Lewis. He was 19 years old, an African-American GI stationed at Camp Casey, far from his own home in a country that was not his own. And he had grown up knowing exactly what it felt like to be judged before he had said a single word. He had carried the weight of racism in the United States. He had not expected to see the same thing playing out half a world away, aimed at a child. When he saw how this girl was treated, pushed around, kept at the edges, alone, something in him refused to look past it. It did not happen quickly. By Lewis's own recollection, it took time. At first, the girl would not speak to anyone. She had every reason not to. By her own account, she had built up a wall against Americans by then, shaped both by her father's absence and by everything her life had taught her about people who looked the way Lewis did. But Lewis and a few of the other young soldiers kept showing up anyway. They were boys themselves, not much older than she was, and they decided this child was worth their attention. They brought her clothes. They brought her food. They pooled their money so she could take English lessons. They sat with her and spoke slowly so she could follow along. They bought her hamburgers, a small luxury in a poor town. They brought her onto the base and showed her where they worked. The way you might show a younger sister something you were proud of. And crucially, Lewis got to know her mother so that this woman would understand that her daughter was being looked after, that she was, for the first time in a long time, not entirely alone. The wall came down. By her own later account, knowing these men changed something fundamental in how she saw the world. She came to believe that people were people, that the kindness or cruelty was not in the skin, but in the person, and that these particular Americans were good to her, treating her as if she were their own little sister. For a while, in a town that had given her almost nothing, she had been seen. But soldiers are not permanent fixtures. Within roughly a year, Lewis and his unit were rotated back to the United States. And in that era, before the internet, before easy international calls, when an ordinary GI and a poor Korean girl lived in completely different worlds, staying connected across an ocean was very nearly impossible. For a little while, they tried. Letters crossed the Pacific in both directions for a year or two. And then the letters stopped. No notice, no final goodbye, just silence where a voice used to be. On his side, Lewis had no way to know what became of her. He did not know whether she was safe, whether her life had improved or fallen apart, whether the girl who once dreamed of being a nurse had been given any chance at all. And on her side, the problem was even worse. Among themselves, the soldiers had mostly used nicknames. She had laughed with them, leaned on them, been rescued by them. And yet, when they were gone, she realized she could not name a single one of them with certainty, except for one. The only name she could hold on to, the one fixed point in the whole memory, was a single word, Lewis. For a long time, the story could have ended there, with a girl who had nothing left of the people who saved her but a single name, and a young man back in America who had no way to know if she had survived at all. But the girl who used to sit alone at the edge of every room did not disappear. She did something almost no one in that town would have predicted. She sang. She had always sung. In the years when school was closed to her and friends were few, music had been the one place where no one could push her out. And slowly, that private comfort became something more. She sang in small clubs and bars, building a name in rooms full of strangers. Then, in 1978, around the age of 20, she joined a groundbreaking all-girl group called the He Sisters and stepped onto a national stage. What happened next says everything about the country she was rising through. Even as audiences responded to her voice, she was barred from certain television programs and singing competitions, not for any lack of talent, but because of her mixed-race features. The same prejudice that had thrown her out of a classroom as a teenager was now waiting for her at the doors of fame. She had simply grown too good to ignore. She went out on her own at the start of the 1980s, and in 1983, she broke through with a hit that lifted her into the front rank of Korean singers. Over the years that followed, across album after album, she became one of the most powerful and emotional voices the country had ever produced. The kind of singer Korea would come to call a diva. The little girl from Dongducheon had become a star, whose name nearly everyone in South Korea would recognize. And yet the old wound never fully closed. In 1994, when she was expecting a child of her own, she made a quiet, telling decision. She flew to the United States to give birth so that her daughter would hold American citizenship. By her own account, she could not bear the thought of her child enduring the same isolation and ridicule she had survived. She had climbed all the way to the top of her world, and still she was trying to build her daughter an escape from it. That is how deep the scars of that childhood ran. Through all of it, the bands, the breakthroughs, the stadiums, she never let go of the memory of the young Americans who had once treated her like a sister. She thought of the food, the English lessons, the way they had looked at her as if she were worth something. Most of all, she thought of Lewis. But she still had only that one name, no address, no first name she could trust, no way to know if the man was even still alive. For decades, the search seemed hopeless, more wish than plan. Then, in 2010, the smallest of coincidences quietly turned the whole story. She had been invited to perform for United States military personnel stationed in Seoul. It was the kind of event she had done many times. But on that occasion, she found herself talking with a senior American officer. Major General Michael Tucker, the commander of the 2nd Infantry Division, the very division tied to the bases she had grown up beside. And she told him her story. She told him about the young soldiers who 40 years earlier had shown a despised little girl genuine kindness. She told him about Lewis, and she asked him, plainly, to help her find them. It is worth pausing on how unlikely this was. She had spent the better part of her life with no trace to follow, and now, by sheer chance, she was standing in front of one of the few people on earth with the reach to actually look. A girl who once had nothing but a single name had just handed that name to a general. The search worked. Word reached Ronald Lewis, by then a man in his late 50s, that someone in Korea was looking for him. The final link in the chain was almost absurdly modern. A message on Facebook telling him that a woman halfway around the world had been searching for him for years. He could hardly believe it. The frightened, ostracized child he had befriended and then lost in 1972, the girl he had quietly worried about ever since, was alive and had become a superstar. Not long after nearly 4 decades of silence, The two of them finally heard each other's voices again, one on each side of the ocean. But hearing a voice is not the same as standing face to face. They had still never been in the same room as grown adults. An entire ocean and almost 40 years of separate lives still lay between the phone call and the embrace. And there was something Ronald Lewis had been holding on to all that time, something he had carried and kept and refused to throw away for one specific reason he had been waiting nearly 40 years to act on. It happened on an ordinary Saturday in the summer of 2011 on a quiet residential street in northeast Wilmington, Delaware. She was in the United States for a concert tour. He was waiting outside his own front door on East 35th Street, the way a person waits when they are afraid to believe something good is finally about to be true. He had changed, of course. Nearly 40 years had passed since a town called Dongducheon, and his beard had gone partly white. But his eyes were the same brown they had always been, the same eyes that had once looked at a frightened, ostracized child and decided she was worth seeing. A van pulled up, the door slid open, and the woman who stepped out onto that sidewalk, a national superstar, a voice known across an entire country, did not arrive like a star. She took one look at the man who had befriended her when she was a despised 15-year-old, and she broke. She crossed the distance and held on to him, and she did not let go for more than a minute. He held her just as tightly. He was crying too. They were not the only ones. The children each of them had gone on to have, in the separate lives they had built across all those years, stood and wept on that sidewalk. His neighbors wept. His grown son, a physician who had traveled in just to witness this, watched his father embrace a woman from the other side of the world and said simply that this was his dad. As if that explained everything, which perhaps it did. On the sidewalk, she said only that it was a miracle. She had not flown across an ocean to tell him about her albums or her fame. She had come to tell him the one thing she had been carrying for decades. That he could stop worrying now. That the girl he had quietly prayed for and dreamed about and never been able to find had not been left behind on some Korean street. That she had made it. That she was all right. She had come, in the end, not to be thanked, but to release him from the worry of a lifetime. She had brought gifts. There were flowers. And there was a small statue she placed in his hands with a name carved into it. Without you, I'm nothing. It showed 7 ducks. 5 rested on a flat, calm sea. 1 was straining upward, fighting to climb the face of a wave, and 1 had already reached the top. By her family's telling, the duck in the middle, the one still struggling against the water, was her. The ducks below were her family and her fans, holding her up from underneath. And the duck at the very top, the one reaching down to pull her higher, was him. Then Lewis gave her something in return. Something he had been keeping for almost 40 years, waiting for exactly this. It was her childhood photo album. He had held on to it across 4 decades and an ocean, refusing to let it go, because the two of them had made a pact long ago that she would have it back the day they met again. He put it into her hands and told her, in his own plain way, that there were a great many memories inside that she had lost, and that now, at last, they were hers again. There had never been anything romantic between them. To her, He had always been, and would always be, a big brother. That was the whole of it, and it was enough. They went inside his house and talked in his living room for more than an hour. Two people stitching back together a thread that had been cut when they were barely more than children. That night, and on his own terms, he went to hear her sing. And then there is what she did with the rest of it. She could have let the story end at a happy reunion. Instead, 2 years later, in a county in Gangwon province, she opened a school. It was built for children who carried exactly what she had once carried. Children of more than one heritage. The kind of children Korea had so often pushed to the edges of its classrooms. She made it tuition-free. She gave it a name that means, more or less, the clear sky that comes after the rain. And she ran it herself. Think about what that quietly says. A man had once looked at a child everyone else had decided to discard and treated her as though she mattered, bought her hamburgers, taught her English, sat with her until the wall came down. 40 years later, that child, now a woman with the means to do almost anything, chose to spend it building a room where the next ostracized child would walk in and, perhaps for the first time, be seen. She did not announce a lesson. She simply did for others what had once been done for her. The kindness had not ended with her. It had only been waiting for somewhere to go. He was an ordinary man. He never grew rich or famous. By the accounts of people who knew him, he spent his later years quietly helping others through his church. The same way he had once quietly helped a girl by the side of a base in a foreign country. He may never have fully grasped how far 1 year of decency given to one lonely child would eventually travel. So before you go, let one question sit with you for a moment. Has someone ever done something for you? Something small at the time, easy for them to forget, that quietly changed the direction of your whole life? And did you ever find the words to thank them for it? If that face is coming to mind right now, tell us about them in the comments. Some debts are never too old to name out loud.